Peace, peace, peace. We back, we back. I'm gonna get a quick check so I can check the live sounds on everybody. Okay, that's coming out. Front end. TMH, so let me get a sound bit from you. I just want to check everybody levels. Alright, got them all the way up on this end. Alright. And again, we'll be taking off and starting from going back through Joseph Brant, also touching up on the importance of it because yesterday we did the corn planter, chief corn planter, and it shows how a lot of the presidents, senators, people high stature tie back into a lot of these tribes that tie back into the lands. That's why we say again the importance of genealogy, why it is so important. Because as we learned yesterday, the corn planters tied directly back into the Bush family, giving them ties back to the land. I mean, we might not like it, but it is what it is. Come bringing it out. We have to deal with it. We got to face the truth and deal with it. Pull this up. And you said the last mark that we had was Bryant was okay, found it. All right, taking off from where we was. It states Bryant was a nostalgic for the Kanakai, and as much possible, Brant tried to recreate the world he had left behind in the Grand River Valley. As part of Brant's efforts to recreate the Kanakai on the Grand, he tried unsuccessfully to persuade all of the Hadusan who gone into exile into Canada to settle on the Grand River Valley. Many of the Handusani who went into exile preferred to take up the British offer on land on the Bay of Quinte, which was further from the United States. Within the Mohawk people, the traditional divisions between those living in the town of Tonadoj and those living in the town of Kanajori persisted, with most of the Tonadoj Mohawks preferring the Bay of Quinte to the Grand River Valley. Brant did not discourage whites from settling around the Grand River Valley, and at the beginning of every May, Brant hosted a reunion of Loyalists, veterans from New York. At Brant's town, veterans of Brant's, volunteers, the Indian Department, and Butler's Rangers would meet to remember their war services, while Brant and other former officers would give speeches to the veterans aimed much drinking, dancing, and horse racing to go along with the reunions. Through the Grand River Valley had been given to the Iroquois, Brant allowed white veterans of Brant's volunteers to settle on his land. The very first white settlers on the Grand were Hendrick Nils, Hendrick Nillies and his family. The Huff brothers, John and Hendrick, Adam Young and his family, and Don Dochester, all veterans of the Brant volunteers who Brant invited to settle. Brant was trying to recreate the human geography of Kanakai along the Grand, as the families he allowed to settle by the Grand River had all been his neighbors. In Kanakai before the war, Brant gave leases with an average size of 400 acres to former loyalists along the Grand River, which became an important source of revenue for the Iroquois, as well recreating the multiracial and multicultural world that Brant had grown up in. Not all the Iroquois appreciated Brant's willingness to allow white veterans to settle in the Grand River Valley, with two Mohawk veterans, Aaron and Isaac Hill, threatening a community meeting to kill Brant for bringing white people to settle in their lands, which ended with the Hills leaving for the Bay of Quinte. Paxton wrote that European and American writers coming from a patriarchal culture almost completely ignored the clan mothers, intended to give Iroquois headmen, orators, and sachems far more power than what they possessed, and it was easily extravagated Brant's power. However, Paxton noted that way in which critics like the Hills attacked Brant as the author of certain policies suggests that Brant was no empty vessel. Rather, he had transformed his wartime alliances into a broad based peacetime coalition capable of forwarding a Pacific agenda. Much to everyone's surprise, Molly Brant did not settle at Brant's town, instead, settling in Kingston. Molly wanted the best education for her 8 children and felt Kingston offered better schools than what were to be found in the settlement run by her brother. It states in 17 in November 1785, Brant traveled to London to ask King George III for assistance in defending the Indian Confederacy from attack by the Americans. The government granted Brant a generous pension and agreed to fully compensate the Mohawk for their losses. But they did not promise to support the Confederacy. In contrast to the settlement, which the Mohawk received, Loyalists were compensated for only a fraction of their property losses. The Crown promised to pay the Mohawk some 15,000, we'll say pounds, and to pay both Joseph and his sister Molly pensions for their war services. During his time in London, Brant attended masquerade balls, visited the freak shows, dined with the debauched Prince of Wales, and finished the angelic Mohawk prayer book. I hate when this thing jumps. Hold on 1 second. Page jumped on me. And it says, and finished the angelic Mohawk prayer book that he had begun before the war. He also took a diplomatic trip to Paris, returning to Quebec City in June 1786. It states upon. Mm-hmm. He everywhere. Oh, y'all ain't hear nothing yet. Y'all didn't hear nothing yet. It didn't even get good yet. It didn't get good yet. It's just getting started. That's the warm up. It says upon his return, Brant was notably more critical of the British. For instance, calling the colonial secretary Lord Sydney a stupid blockhead who did not understand the Iroquois. At the same time, Brant's relations with John Johnson declined, with Johnson siding with the Hills against Brant's land policies along the Grand River Valley. In December 1786, what you saying? Yeah, because he was bringing in his friends from that fought along with him. Yeah, basically he was trying to recreate another melting pot. In December 1786, Brant, along with leaders of the Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Wyandotte, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Potawatomi nations, met at the Wyandotte village of Brownstown and renewed the wartime Confederacy in the West by issuing a statement to the American government, declaring the Ohio River as the boundary between them and whites. Nevertheless, despite Brant's effort to produce an agreement favorable to the Brownstown Confederacy and to the British interests, he also would be willing to compromise later with the United States. In 1789, a trivial incident strained Brant's relations with the British. Brant attempted to enter Fort Niagara, carrying his weapons, and was told by a sentry that as an Indian he would have to lay down his arms. An indigent Brant refused, saying that as both a Mohawk warrior chief and as British Army officer he would keep his weapons, and the commandant of Fort Niagara agreed that Brant would enter with his weapons. Nonetheless, the incident left a sour taste in Brant's mouth, as he noted that white officers in the British Army were not asked to remove their weapons when entering a fort. From 1790 onward, Brant had been planning on selling much of the land along the Grand River granted by the Heidelman, yeah, the Heidelman Proclamation, and using the money from the sales to finance the modernization of the Haudenosaunee community to allow them equal standing with the European population. Furthermore, in 1790, after Americans attacked the Western Confederacy in the Northwestern Indian War, sending General, which is Joshua Harmar, on a punitive expedition, member tribes asked Brant and the Six Nations to enter the war on their side. Brant refused. He instead asked Lord Dushaw, the new governor of Quebec, for British assistance. Dorchester, that's how I believe you pronounce it, assistance. Dorchester also refused, but later in 1794 he provided the Indians with arms and provisions. And after the defeat of General Josiah Harmar in 1790 at the hands of Little Turtle, the United States became interested in having Brant mediate as war secretary. Henry Knox wrote several letters to Brant asking him to persuade Little Turtle of the Western Confederacy to lay down his arms. Harmar's defeat proved to the U.S. government that Indians of the Northwest were not conquered peoples, and it would require a war to bring them under U.S. authority. Brant extravagated his influence with the Western Confederacies in his letters to the U.S. officials. Knowing if the Americans were quoting him, then the British would likewise engage in gestures to keep his loyalty. Brant was attempting to revive the traditional playoff system in order to strengthen the position of his people. However, Brant knew that the British were not willing to go to war with the United States to save the Western Confederacy, and his position was not as strong as it seemed. It states as a mediator, Brant suggested to the Americans that they cease white settlement in most of the lands west of the Ohio River, while advising the Western Confederacy to negotiate with the Americans, saying that after Harmar's defeat, they held the upper hand, and now was the time to negotiate peace before the Americans brought more military forces into the old Northwest. Brant also advised the Americans to negotiate with the Western Confederacy as a whole, instead with the individual nations at the same time. Used his talks with the Americans to impress upon the British that they needed to have respect for First Nation land rights in Upper Canada. The peoples of the Northwest had often had difficult relations with the Iroquois in the past, and were primarily interested in enlisting Brant's aid as a way of bringing the British into the war on their side. In June 1791, Brant was publicly challenged by representatives of the Western Confederacy to take up the hatchet against the Americans, and by refusing his influence, whatever it was on the Western Confederacy ended forever. Though Brant had warned the Western Confederacy that they were fighting a war that they could not hope to win. In November 1791, Little Turtle inflicted a crushing defeat on the American general Arthur St. Clair, which made Brant appear both cowardly and foolish. After St. Clair's defeat, Little Turtle sent Brant the scalp of Richard Butler, who had one of the U.S. Indian commissioners who negotiated the Treaty of the Fort Stanwix together with the message, "You, Chief Mohawk, what are you doing? Time was when you rose us to war and told us that if all Indians would join with the king, they should be a happy people and become independent. In a very short time, you changed your voice and went to sleep and left us in the lurch." It was widely noted in the Northwest that amongst the victorious warriors who defeated St. Clair were the Shawnee, Miami, Ottawa, Wyandots, Chippewas, Potawatomi, Cherokee, Mingos, and Lenape, but none were from the Six Nations. In 1792, the American government invited Brant to Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, where he met President George Washington and his cabinet. The Americans offered him a huge. In 1792, the American government invited Brant to Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, where he met President George Washington and his cabinet. The Americans offered him a large pension and reservation in upstate New York for the Mohawks to try to lure them back. Brant refused, but Pickering said that Brant did take some cash payments. George Washington told Henry Knox in 1794 to buy Captain Brant off at almost any price. Brant attempted a compromise peace settlement between the Western Confederacy and the Americans, but he failed. In 1793, Brant spoke at a council meeting of the Western Confederacy where he suggested that they accept the American settlements north of the Ohio River while excluding white settlement to the rest of the land west of the Ohio as the price of peace. Brant was outvoted, and the assembled chiefs announced that no white settlement west of the Ohio were the only peace terms they were willing to accept. The war continued, and the Indians were defeated in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The unity of the Western Confederacy was broken with the peace treaty of Greenville in 1795. The defeat of the Western Confederacy led to the Americans losing interest in Brant as a mediator, causing a collapse of his attempts to play the British off against the Americans. Goes on to say Brant often clashed with General. Mm-hmm.
This dude, like Antonio said, is like a daggone triple agent. Can everybody hear us out there?
1 2 1 2.
Mic check, mic check.
This man, he ain't. This man playing all sides.
Was he not aware that the British and the United States were still on speaking terms because they were at war in other they were now warring against other countries on other continents?
I think that's the part that got him in the end.
Can y'all hear us?
Because everything turned up on the max on our end.
Free, are you saying it's hard to hear because of the truth, or you saying it's hard to hear because our volume is low?
And so they can only hear me now.
Cliff Tip says she's the one can only hear Bone.
All right, hold on. Let me. What is going on? This doesn't make no sense.
So they can't really hear us.
Hold on.
Mic check.
I know that was an issue yesterday, and towards the end of the show, you were able to get my volume right and those sellouts right.
All right, y'all give him a mic
So
check.
while he's working on it,
Mic
mic check.
check,
Can
mic
y'all
check,
hear us? Hello, 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 hello,
mic
hello.
check, mic
Give
check.
us some ones if you can hear no sellout and I.
One
Good,
for
very
TMA.
well,
One, one, two,
really,
1 2. Mic check.
really. So we don't.
I don't hear nothing. I don't hear nobody saying that. I don't
Yeah,
hear.
I see check.
Cliff
You
Tiff
sound. They
says
said you
I'm
sound
good.
really far
What up,
away.
Cliff? Put the
Um.
microphone on your mouth, sir.
So, so
Very good.
okay,
Okay, for you.
so we're
Oh, that
good
one.
now.
Y'all don't
Is
want to hear me. I
is
understand.
no
Oh,
sellout
everybody.
good?
Okay. I see
Okay,
three
Yeah, that's
Cliff,
she
checks.
said.
Cliff.
Everybody good.
There's
Okay.
three of
That's the funny thing. I ain't even do
them.
nothing.
What you mean you didn't do nothing?
I didn't click
He just
nothing.
stared at it. He got his
Yeah, I looked
desk
around at
staring.
the volume. Everything was maxed out. I'm like, okay. Next day, be like, okay, we can hear.
Word.
See,
Well,
I don't know
it's
what's.
the magic of magic.
I guess.
Teach me how to levitate.
Look, hold on. I mean, but this dude was a piece of work. That's
Piece of work is an understatement. He was the
Man, why don't
first
he just
player.
go sit on his
He
watch
played it. He
something?
trying to play all sides, and we still ain't get to the juicy
Yeah.
part.
Don't you?
you mean there's more?
Man, this
Oh
ain't
my
nothing.
gosh.
This ain't nothing. I told
Yeah.
y'all this part of the story where I
Yes,
done
it
got
is.
down to. Man,
This guy.
y'all give me 1 second.
All right. Well, while you doing that, I'll go ahead and finish reading since everybody can hear us now. Um, uh, it says Brant often clashed with General John Graves Simcoe, the governor of Upper Canada. In 1791, following tensions between French speakers and English speakers, the province of Quebec had been divided into two new colonies: Lower Canada, modern southern Quebec, and Upper Canada, modern southern Ontario. Brant had begun selling some of the land he owned along the Grand River to British settlers with the intention of investing the profits into the trust that would make the Six Nations economically and politically independent. Have we read this already?
I don't think so. Hold on, the playoff
Okay.
system. Where we at?
And politically independent of the British. Simcoe sabotaged Brant's plans by announcing that the Six Nations were only allowed to sell land to the Crown, which would then resell it to white settlers. Okay, they go to double cross or the triple cross.
Messed up.
On 14 January 1793, Simcoe issued a patent to the Haldimand Proclamation, which stated that the Brant's land did not extend to the beginning of the Grand River, as the Haldimand Proclamation has stated, and that the Haudenosaunee did not have the legal right to sell or lease their land to private individuals, and instead were to deal only with the crown. Sound like some of the stuff they was doing in the states, right?
Mm-hmm.
Brent rejected the Simcoe patent, saying that the Simcoe did not have the right to alter the Haldeman Proclamation. The question of whatever the Iroquois own all the land to the beginning of the Grand River to its mouth or not is still, as of the 21st century, part of the ongoing land dispute. Good grief.
Mm-hmm.
Simcoe justified his patent with reference to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which had forbidden white settlement west of the Ohio River, while at the same time giving the Indian tribes living west of the Ohio the right to sell the land only to the Crown, which was the ultimate owner of the land, with the Indians merely having the right of occupancy. Brant disregarded the Simcoe's patent and in 1795 through 1796 sold blocks of the land along the Grand River, receiving some 85,000 sterling, together with interest of 5,119 annually. Simcoe disallowed these land sales as illegal and refused to give the buyers land deeds, but he made no effort to evict the buyers who continued to own the land. Now that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It gets deep.
When the spring of 1795, Brant's son Isaac murdered an American deserter named Lowell, who had settled in the Mohawk community at Grand River. Simcoe insisted that the crown was paramount in Upper Canada, and Isaac Brant would have to face a trial for murder in the Upper Canada court, which would try him according to English common law. Brant, by contrast, insisted that Six Nations were sovereign along their lands of the Grand, and his son would face justice in traditional Mohawk trial before community elders, denying that Simcoe had the legal right to try any Mohawk. The issue of whatever the Six Nations were sovereign along their lands besides the Grand River, as Brant insisted, or possessing a limited sovereignty subjected to the authority of the crown, as argued by Simcoe, had been brought to the head by the question of whether Isaac Brant was to be tried by an Upper Canada court or by Mohawk elders. And Brant's actions were motivated then by his desire to protect his son. Simcoe threatened to call out the Upper Canada militia to take Isaac Brant by force when his father refused to turn him over, but was overruled by London Deutscher, Deutscher, who told Simcoe that the murder of one deserter from U.S. Army was scarcely worth a war with the Six Nations, especially as British was at war with the revolutionary France. Man, they stay at war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All you got to do is look at the
Like,
years.
nah.
Because this is what, in the 1780s, 1790s. Yeah. They fighting each other
Yeah,
over there. And not to mention fighting with. Let me hush. That's another. All right. Fighting the war with China at the same time.
that's right. Brand had responded to Simcoe's threat to call out the Upper Canada militia, and it would be seen who the most interest with the militia and the governor would not be able to make them act against him. Most of the white settlers along the Grand River had given lands by Brant, and many of men had fought with him during the Revolutionary War. And Brant believed that they would not act against him if it came to a showdown with Simcoe. In 1798, a Moravian missionary who traveled along the Grand River Road. All the settlers are in a kind vas- vassalage to him. All the settlers are in a kind of vassalage to him, meaning Brant. The issue resolved itself later that year when, during the distribution of presents from the crown to the Iroquois chiefs at head of the lake, modern Burlington, Ontario, Isaac had too much to drink in a local tavern and began to insult his father. Mm-mm-mm. Joseph Brant happened to be in a neighboring room, and upon hearing what Isaac was saying, marched in and ordered his son to be silent, reminding him that insulting one's parents was a grave breach of courtesy for the Mohawk. When an intoxicated Isaac continued to insult him, Joseph slapped him across the face, causing Isaac to pull out a knife and take a swing at his father. In the ensuing fight, Joseph badly wounded his son by turning his own knife against him, by deflecting the blow which caused the knife to strike Isaac's head instead. And later that night, Isaac died of his wounds. Brant was to be haunted by the death of his son for the rest of his life, feeling much guilt over what he had done. What he had done. 1796, Upper Canada appeared to be on the brink of a war with the Mississaugas. In August 1795, a Mississauga chief named Wabakanine had arrived at Upper Canada's capital, York, modern Toronto, Ontario, with his family. A British soldier, Private Charles McEwen, was invited by Wabakanine's sister into her bed, and neither saw fit to inform Wabakanine of their planned tryst under his roof. When Wabakanine woke up to relieve himself after a night of heavy drinking, he saw an unknown naked white man with his sister and apparently assumed he had been raped. She had been raped. He had raped her and attacked him. In the ensuing struggle, McEwen killed Wabakanine, and though charged with murder, was acquitted by a white jury under the grounds of self-defense. The Mississaugas were incensed with the verdict and threatened war if McEwen was not turned over to them to face their justice and demand the crown and a demand the crown refused. It's amazing how the same thing that they wanted justice for
Yep.
now they're not giving to the crown.
Nah, like
Mm-hmm.
nah. We're not gonna give. You don't get that.
Despite their differences with Brant over the land sales of the Grand, the crown asked him for his help, and Brant visited the Mississaugas to argue for peace, persuading them to accept the verdict, reminding them that under Mississauga law, self-defense was a valid excuse for killing someone, and even Wabakanine's sister had stated the sex was consensual, and she had tried to stop her brother when he attacked McEwen, screaming she had not been raped, but that he would not listen. Because he was drunk. Historically, the Howden, the Howden, so, the Howden, so Ani, and the Mississauga were enemies with the Six Nations, mocking the Mississaugas as a fish people, a reference to the Mississaugas' practice of covering their bodies with fish oil.
They hate.
And it was a sign of Brant's charisma and charm that he was able to persuade the Mississaugas not to go war with the crown, as they had been threatening. Afterwards, Brant was able to form an alliance with the Mississaugas, with the men, and later taking it to shaving their head in the distinctive hairstyle of the Mohawk, popularly known as a Mohawk. The governor of Upper Canada, Peter Russell, felt threatened by the Pan Indian Alliance, telling the Indian Department officials to format an existing jealousy between the Chippewas, Mississaugas, and the Six Nations, and to prevent any junction or good understanding between these two tribes. Okay, I gotta stop there.
All right.
Remember, we came across this Pan Indian thing again.
Yes, we did.
So I'm assuming they are viewing what's being done with the Mississaugas as a pan Indian alliance. So are we to assume that the Mississaugas were against joining with the Europeans? Okay. So so now as we're starting to understand and see how things work, and I think this story is nothing more than a microcosm of what was happening throughout the tribes throughout the continent of America, both North America, Central America, and South America.
Mm-hmm. Because what happened was the British made promises to a bunch of tribes. And what happened is during the war, Britain had to start pulling out. And you read to where they wasn't honoring none of the deals that they made. They wasn't finna help them fight nobody. They wasn't finna help them fight the Americans. They were basically gonna leave them to their own devices. So the other nations seeing that was like, hold on, we ain't working with none of you.
Here's where I guess, and again, because we have hindsight and we can see this play out. But I would like to think by this time of dealing with these Europeans for at least now through it's going on 300 years, you know they their modus operandi. They make promises, they don't keep them, and then to allow you to get more land, you have to go to war for them again, just to keep land they intend on taking. Is that am I missing that?
Plans on you hit it right on the head. Because why would they honor any deals? I mean, not taking no blame for nobody. But let's look at it this way. If I see a group of people screwing each other over with deals, why would I honor anything? Because when you look at it,
The thing,
everybody was doing backdoor deals on each other.
yeah.
And the,
And here's a part, and here's a part. Go ahead.
and did anybody notice that the northwest of America is settled by the British? I'm just asking. Anybody notice that yet? That there's British settlements on the west coast?
Yeah, but here's the reason why it's important to look at who's gonna vouch for you. Because think about this: the Masasagwa and the Haudenosaunee were enemies. Brant was very good at forming an alliance. Now, all of a sudden, the governor of Upper Canada felt threatened by the Pan Indian Alliance, telling the Indian Department officials to format an existing jealousy between the Chippewas, the Mississaugas. So they called the Mississaugas the Chippewas, and the Six Nations, and to prevent any junction or good understanding between these two tribes. Now we have to understand that this was not the first time that any European had done this to a tribe. And I'm sure other tribes have seen this done. So how could you let I already know the answer, but it bears to be asked because this is things that we have to guard against now, even with people that look like us. How can you let someone do some he said, she said stuff without getting all parties together to verify what was said? Because that will keep all of that from happening. That's why everybody must be tested. I don't care who it is. And if you got a
Everybody.
problem with being tested, then you are the problem.
Facts.
So then it goes on to read that Brian, for his part, complained to Russell that my sincere attachment has ruined the interests of my nation.
Mm-hmm.
In early 1797, Brant traveled again to Philadelphia to meet the British diplomat Robert Liston and United States government officials. In a speech to Congress, Brant assured the Americans that he would never again take up the tomahawk against the United States. That was a bad statement. At
Mm-hmm.
this time, the British were with France and Spain. While in Philadelphia, Brant also met with the French diplomat Pierre Auguste Adet. He stated he would offer his services to the French minister Adet and march his Mohawks to assist in effecting a revolution and overturning the British government in the province. When Brant returned home, there were fears of the French attack. Peter Russell wrote, The present alarming aspect of affairs, we are threatened with an invasion by the French and Spaniards from the Mississippi, and the information we have received